Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 8 of Logic and Critical Thinking. In this lecture, we turn our attention to credibility, the idea of credibility. So, at this point in the course, we've finished sections 1 and 2, and we're in the middle of section 3. So, in the previous lecture, Lecture 7, we took a look at issues with respect to clarity and how to, in particular, especially towards the end, how to improve our ability as writers and so that's a theme that we're going to, again, sort of try to work on throughout this entire section is our ability as writers with those brief writing assignments in each of the homework assignments for each of the chapters of this section. So in this particular lecture, then, in the middle of section 3, we're going to turn our attention to issues with respect to credibility. And then the next and final lecture, Lecture 9, final lecture of section 3, we'll turn our attention to the idea of rhetoric, things that are related emotionally to what's being said, right, to what's being conveyed, that we as critical thinkers want to be especially on guard against, because strictly speaking, it has no bearing on the logical merits of what's being said, and oftentimes it can unduly sway us. So that's what we have to look forward to in Lecture 9. So again, though in Lecture 8, what we will do here is we'll turn our attention to this idea of credibility. So one of the themes kind of that I'll try to develop is this idea that we're kind of claim filters, right? As critical thinkers, our job is to kind of take what's being said, conveyed to us, or whether we're reading it, whether we're in conversations with people, and sort of run it through our logic and critical thinking filters, right? Ideally. And part of that process then is going to be assessing what's being said in terms of the things we'll talk about with respect to credibility. So we'll talk about, for example, how I got a roadmap here as usual, what we'll be doing, right? We'll talk about the two key sources of suspicion when it comes to credibility, the claim itself, and then the source of the claim. And we'll get into, excuse me, what sorts of factors ought to be most pertinent in our minds when it comes to assessing these key factors. We'll notice how as well there's two factors within each of those, so it gets even more nuanced. Right? We'll delve into the detail as we proceed, obviously. And then we'll finish the second portion of this lecture. We'll talk about media and advertising, two of the things that really get me going the most. So we'll have a lot to say, as the authors do, right, of the textbook with respect to credibility, how credible is the mass media in particular, and the idea of media in general. We'll run through all the different sorts of, or some of the main kinds or versions of media and sort of the things we ought to be cognizant of as critical thinkers with respect to those versions of the media. And then we'll also say some things with respect to credibility when it comes to advertising, as I'll try to suggest, and as I think the authors ultimately tried to suggest. It's arguably one of our number one enemies, one of the things we ought to be on guard against the most as critical thinkers. That'll be one of the themes as we'll see, so stay tuned for that. So that in general is the game plan for Lecture 8. Let's go ahead and dive in, as I like to say. So we'll go ahead and turn to slide 2 and kind of give a very brief introduction to the lecture itself. Again, we're talking about issues with respect to credibility, this idea of when is something that's said credible? When should it kind of, and this is, as critical thinkers, I think we always opt to kind of analyze what's being said to decide ultimately whether it's true or false. But when it comes to credibility, the idea is we kind of, as it passes through our filter initially, right, we kind of give it a rough assessment usually. All right, and the idea is if there's any issues with respect to credibility, it ought to raise some red flags, and we ought to spend more time, even more time than we otherwise would, assessing what's being said. So one of the sort of side points then is, hey, even if something seems to be coming from a credible source, we have no reason to doubt it on the face of it, you still need to analyze it, right? And conversely, just because something comes from a less than credible source, or you have reasons to be suspicious doesn't mean you ever have immediate license to dismiss it. You always have to, nevertheless, analyze it to some degree, right, to make sure that it doesn't hold, merit nonetheless. So again, just some preliminary points I want to throw out there. We're dealing with ideas with respect to credibility in general here. As they say on page 102 of our textbook, this is the 13th edition. This chapter focuses on determining, quote, when a claim or source of a claim is credible enough to warrant belief. So as I point out in the second bullet point there on slide 2, it is worth mentioning that, like some things that we talk about, many things arguably in this class, it's not something that's black and white. Right? It's not an on-off switch like, say, validity, the concept of validity going back to section 2. Right? The idea of credibility, it's more in flux, right? It's more of a spectrum. We have very credible to not very credible at all. Right? There's no on-off switch where it's either credible or not credible. Right? At least that's how I would encourage you to think of it, and that's how the authors of the textbook encouraged you to think of it as well. And so kind of what we'll be up to then is suggesting things that you should always be aware of as you're assessing these various claims as critical thinkers, right? As they're going through your claim filters as critical thinkers, things with respect to credibility that you ought to have sort of in mind. Again, the idea is you never have license, oh, not credible, doesn't seem credible, to immediately dismiss the claim. Right, what's being said, you ought to still assess it, right? Or the alternative, right? You never have a license to immediately endorse something because it's coming from a credible source and you have no reason to think it's suspicious on the face of things. So again, that's why it's not black and white. It's more like you kind of, it's like an indicator, a gauge, right? And you might be on red alert. Or you might be more towards the green, but you always ought to, as critical thinkers, assess ultimately what's being said. I would want to make sure that point is ultimately being made here, right? Okay, so moving on then to the bottom of slide 2. In general, quote, if a claim either lacks credibility or comes from a source that lacks credibility, it should be viewed with suspicion, and then we'll end quote. That's from page 110 of the 9th edition, and we'll develop that idea further as we proceed here. There's ultimately kind of two main grounds, if you will, that arouse our suspicion, or that ought to arouse our suspicion when it comes to the credibility of what's being said. And I just pointed out at the bottom of the slide too what I've already been hammering home here. Just because something is coming from a less than credible source doesn't give us license to immediately dismiss it. Okay, so moving on to slide 3, let's go ahead then and develop that idea that there's two general sources of suspicion when it comes to the credibility of what's being said. Okay, and so that's what I'm outlining on slide 3 and what I have up here, right? Two primary sources then. We have what's known as or what we'll refer to as the claim itself, right? The inherent content of the claim or what's being said. And that can arouse our suspicion or at times throw up the flag, right? And as we'll see, there's kind of two main reasons why that might be the case, okay? Or alternatively, something else that might raise a flag for us, okay, with respect to credibility, right, is the source of the claim, okay? Never mind what the inherent content is, right? But if we have reason to be suspicious about the person, for example, telling us what's being said, well, that's an issue too, okay? And as we'll see, that also, right, we raise that flag for two basic reasons as well that we'll get into when we get into that in more detail here in a moment. Okay, so two general primary reasons why we become suspicious with respect to what's being said. We'll join the authors in kind of thinking of it that way, at least. So at the top of slide 3, as the authors suggest in the 10th edition, page 106, thus, quote, there are two grounds for suspicion in cases where credibility is the issue. So first, as I mentioned, the claim. So, I don't know, I was actually kind of thinking of this. One of their examples, right, where the claim itself seems inherently suspicious was ducks quacking in Morse code. Then I started to think about that. I don't know that would immediately on the face of it strike me as not plausible. I don't know what they're doing when they're quacking or what sort of sequence there is. And now, if I investigate it and listen to it a little bit in more detail, right, sure, I might be able to discern a difference, right? But I would have to look into it a little bit. The idea they want to suggest, right, or that we want to suggest here with respect to this, Okay, as at times there are claims that seem so far-fetched, right, that we can just immediately dismiss them. Okay, and that's the kind of thing that we have in mind here. And again, it might be a spectrum, right? Ducks quacking in Morse code, that certainly strikes me as a lot less plausible than other things that are being said. Granted, I would have to personally, and I'd have to take at least make some sort of investigation into it, admittedly. Okay, so there's this idea of initial plausibility, which I want to throw up here as well. So and that is referenced, where is that? In the middle, basically, of slide 3. The author suggested they gave a lot better examples, I think, which I should have included in the notes, since I'm not as convinced of their ducks quacking in Morse code example. But they were trying to intimate that, hey, that sort of claim, it has no initial plausibility, which is, as they define on page 107 of our text, quote, a rough assessment of how likely or unlikely they seem to us, the claims, that is. Right. So the idea is, the authors are suggesting with respect to the ducks quacking in Morse code, hey, it has no initial plausibility. And so we want to be familiar with this idea of initial plausibility. It's just the idea that whenever we, right, as claim filters receive claims, or at least we ought to be, assessing it, giving it a rough assessment, a very initial rough assessment in terms of its plausibility. We call that its initial plausibility, right? Does it pass the immediate test, eye test, so to speak, but with respect to our critical thinking eyes, right? If it doesn't, as they suggest, the ducks quacking in Morse code, then hey, we know we're very likely to dismiss it. It might not take near as much investigation as other claims, which have a lot more initial plausibility. They seem a lot more likely on the face of things. Right? So that's the idea here, right? We give things kind of a rough overall assessment at the get-go, and that's the idea behind this notion of initial plausibility. And also, as I suggested, then the source of the claim can be an issue, right, and arouse suspicion when it comes to credibility. So, as the authors point out, when it comes to credibility, quote, a person who stands to gain from our belief in a claim is known as an interested party. And interested parties must be viewed with much more suspicion than disinterested parties who have no stake in our belief one way or another. And that's from 111. And so that's going to be a very important theme that we'll develop as we proceed here, right, that the authors allude to several times, is this idea of interested parties. We always have to be on the lookout as critical thinkers for interested parties, people who have something to gain from us believing and doing certain things, right? And that's why advertising, there's always an interested party when it comes to advertising, and that's why usually, in some sense, it's enemy number one as critical thinkers, or at least our number one suspect, or one of the number one suspects we ought to be on guard against, right, is advertising. For that reason, because again, advertisers are interested parties. They have something to gain. They always have something to gain by presenting us the ad. Otherwise, they wouldn't be presenting it to us. So, interested parties, that's what they're pointing out at the bottom of, or what I point out and allude to at the bottom of slide 3. Another example that they also reference in the text. And by the way, this is chapter 4, so we're lecture 8, but it corresponds to chapter 4 of the 13th edition. And one of the examples they give of an interested party, the classic example, is the mechanic, right? So if your mechanic tells you that you need a laundry list of repairs, you might want a second opinion, right? That's a classic example of an interested party. So some things, right, to keep in mind: 2 main sources of suspicion when it comes to the credibility of what's being said. Okay, so let's dive in and talk a little bit more about each of these in detail, though. So when does the inherent claim, or the inherent content of the claim itself, warrant some suspicion on our part? As they suggest on page 107 of the 10th edition, so this is again slide 4, quote, a claim lacks inherent credibility to the extent that it conflicts with what we have observed or what we think we know, our background information, or with other credible claims, end quote. Hence, as they allude to in that quote from the 10th edition, there's essentially 2 reasons then why we might become suspicious of the inherent content of the claim itself. Either because it conflicts with what we refer to as our personal observations, right? And think, when we reference this, we mean things that we've just, experienced. So you were outside working all day, right? And you know that it didn't rain at all. Okay? You were out demoing the deck, and you know that for a fact, because you were out there experiencing it yourself, right, perceiving it yourself with your own two eyes and your skin and so on, that it didn't rain. And yet someone later, one other neighbor claimed that it poured for a couple hours. Well, that's conflicting with your personal observations. So that is one way that the claim itself can sort of arouse our suspicion, or it can conflict with what they refer to as background information. And all we mean by that, actually I'll reference that here in a moment on the next slide. Before I get to that, I wanted to point out with respect to our personal observations that, barring like hallucinations and so on, granted that they can be, and the authors do a great job of always offering, examples of how all these things can still be mistaken, right? Granted, our own personal perceptions can be fallible, right? They can be mistaken. They're nevertheless our best resource, right? What we've experienced, what we've smelled, what we've tasted, what we've seen, what we've heard, and then not hearkening on memories, right? But what we actually have kind of the immediate experience of, or at least not long-term memories, right? We don't want to refer to that because that would be more like background information, or at least drifting into that concept. So what we mean by this, right? Personal observations, personal perceptions. While those are valuable, they're nevertheless our best resource. And so that's the point at the very bottom of slide 4. So while they're valuable, this comes from page 104 of the text. Quote, our own observations provide our most reliable source of information about the world, end quote. So don't ever forget that as critical thinkers. Right? Sometimes it can be easy to lose sight of our own sight, right? And our own sense of smell and sound, and stay rooted in our own experience and remember that, is there anything that we're more convinced of than that? Okay, so if something's at odds with that, obviously that should raise a red flag for us. Okay, but then we have this notion that it again conflicts with what we refer to as background information. And what we mean by that, as they point out, this is the top of slide 5, comes from page 107 of the text. It's a general term for, quote, that immense body of beliefs we have that consists of facts we learn from our own direct observations and facts we learn from others, end quote. It's considered background because, quote, we may not be able to specify where we learned it, end quote. So that's also from 107, as opposed to something we just experienced. So it's the idea that it's somewhere back there. We have this general sense that it's true. We can't pinpoint exactly why. My wife has an incredible sort of store of background information. I feel like I don't have very much, or at least it's not very as reliable as hers. She'll pull out like these sort of random knowledge, and I'll be like, how do you know that? And she's like, I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure it's true. And then sure enough, we'll look into it, and it turns out to be true. That's the sort of thing they mean by background information. Again, it's not something you just experience, but it's something that you know to be true given your past experiences, what other people have suggested, so on and so forth. Again, but you can't pinpoint exactly why or how it is you know it. Okay. Okay, so as I mentioned at the bottom of slide 5, when it comes to assessing claims, then we have less reason to be suspicious of something if it doesn't conflict with this. Okay. All right, so moving on then to slide 6. We'll go ahead and talk about then assessing, right, the source of the claim, or at least when should that give us cause for concern when it comes to filtering these claims as critical thinkers. So actually, I kind of start with my map down here. This is slide 6, and then slide 7, I get into these. So as I suggest in slide 6, let's start first and foremost with assessing kind of what matters when it comes to the sources of what's being said. By and large, generally speaking, okay, not always true, but as the authors pound home, right, generally speaking, physical stuff, physical traits of the source doesn't matter, right? How old they are, male or female, height, weight, address, like how they appear, right? Or are they dressed in nice clothes, more casual, informal, nothing at all, right? Generally speaking, that doesn't give us good reason to question the source of the claim with respect to its credibility. Not always the case. For example, let's say somebody says something with respect to good physical conditioning, and they look extremely out of shape. Well, then maybe there the physical trait would matter, right? But by and large, as the authors suggest, that doesn't matter. What does matter, what should weigh into whether or not we're raising flags with respect to the source of the claim, is what sort of education does the person who's suggesting whatever it is that's being said have, right? Or at least education that's related to what's being said. And that's another point that they mention, right? Their experience, reputation, position, all this matters as long as it's related to what's being said. Right? They might be an expert in one field, but that doesn't mean they are any more knowledgeable or someone we should consult when it comes to another field than anyone else. But in general, though, all things being equal, what does matter, or what we should consider, is the pertinent education, their related experience, what sort of the reputation they have in the field with respect to what's being claimed. Right? Do they have a good reputation for knowing how to fix cars? Right? And they're telling us that this is what's needed to get our car back into good shape for that long drive we have ahead of us. Right? Reputation matters. It's something we should consider in general. Okay, and what position do they hold? Is it a highly touted, well-respected position? Or have they been a well-known mechanic? Known in the field for 30 plus years. Well, that matters. Right? They might still be an interested party, right? But these sorts of things, nonetheless, are also matter when assessing what they're saying. Right? So that's what slide 6 is getting at, sort of what matters and what doesn't, in general, when it comes to, right, we're moving on to the source of the claim. Okay. So remove the irrelevant considerations, which again, in general, is the physical stuff. Okay, that's the top of slide 6. Secondly, quote, interested parties are less credible than other sources of claims, and we've mentioned that, alluded to that a little bit, and so they say that on page 113. And I think that's an important point to hammer home at the outset as well. Again, this interested party, always an issue. While it's true that, this is the next quote from 118 from the 9th edition, while it's true that, quote, an interested party can provide true, accurate, useful information, it is almost always a mistake to simply assume that what one learns from such a source is true and accurate, end quote. So we should still, right, give it a second thought when our 30 years into the business mechanic tells us we need a laundry list of repairs, okay? Because they're still an interested party, right? They still have to pay the bills. They have something to gain out of it, right? No matter how long we've known them as well, okay? Now, again, maybe given all these other things, we're still ultimately less suspicious of them, but they are nonetheless an interested party. Okay? And I really like this point, so they make it on page 115, where they say, quote, it is too easy to lose objectivity where one's interests and concerns are at stake, even if one is trying to be objective, end quote. I think that's an incredibly important point. Right? Even when we're trying as interested parties not to be interested parties, there's too many sort of psychological urges at play, right, to overcome. It's too difficult to be objective in those instances, at least for the vast majority of us. And I think that's an important point to emphasize as well. It's not always the person's fault. They can even be trying to be objective, to be as truthful as possible with respect to the advice they're giving you. But if they're an interested party, that's still going to be, at least the argument is here, that that's still going to be at play there. Okay, so moving on to slide 7 then, as I've alluded to here, there's going to be, much like there was 2 kinds of reasons why we doubt the inherent content of the claim itself. It conflicts with our personal observations, immediate observations or experiences we've had, or it conflicts with our background information. So too, when it comes to the source of the claim, having a general idea now of what matters and what doesn't, there's two basic senses in which, right, the flag is raised for us when it comes to the source of the claim. Okay, and this is what then, again, slide 7 gets at. So bullet point 1 on slide 7 is kind of this idea in general, as I've suggested here, is like bullet point A on the board. There's no expertise, right, with respect, no pertinent knowledge with respect to what's being said, right? We doubt they really know what they're talking about. It's not that they're the second bullet, right, point on slide 7, or what I've called B up here on the board. It's not that they're biased or we have reason to think maybe they're an interested party, but we don't think they really know what they're talking about. All right, so as I've put it in slide 7, this idea of no expertise, we question whether the source has real knowledge about the relevant issue. Okay, and that's where, again, you will be considering these kinds of factors, right, when trying to figure out or assess whether they do have that sort of relevant expertise. And then the second sort of reason to raise the red flag is they seem biased. That's how I put it up here, right? They don't seem, they're an interested party, right? There's an issue when it comes to objectivity or their truthfulness. Okay, moving on to slide 8. I like how the authors kind of got into, well, what do we, and this happens all the time, at least seemingly in my experience, what do you do, because we're supposed to rely on experts, right? Experts in all these fields, right? That we can't possibly spend our time figuring out whether things are true or not. We rely on these so-called experts. Well, what do you do when these experts diverge in terms of what they think or what they're prescribing or suggesting to us? Well, the authors, that's kind of what we'll get into then with slide 8. The authors get into kind of how to handle those situations as critical thinkers. So when there's a divergence in opinion, it's best to suspend judgment. Except when there's a significant sort of majority, right? So, and look, a lot of issues, there's probably going to be some sort of divergence in opinion, right? But if things seem pretty equal, then the idea is, okay, suspend judgment, don't sort of lean one way or another on that issue. But on the other hand, if there seems to be kind of a significant leaning one way or another, then in those cases, go ahead and lean with the majority expert opinion. So that's what I'm getting at in the middle of slide 8. And I mentioned this earlier, and a very important point that they mentioned several times throughout the chapter 4, but I quote them from 116 on the bottom of slide 8 here. So remember that quote, claims put forth by experts about subjects outside their fields are not automatically more acceptable than claims put forth by non-experts, end quote. And they even put it much more eloquently at various other times, right, where they're no more trustworthy than the average Joe Blow down the road, right? So it doesn't matter whether they have a PhD in philosophy, right? If they're giving you mechanical recommendations, how to fix your car, telling you how to fix your car, that PhD doesn't really have any bearing on their recommendations for what to do about your car. Okay? So something to take note of, the point here is something to take note of as a critical thinker. Okay, so that was slide 8. Let's go ahead. We've checked off all of our boxes here for all this stuff. We talked about the two sources of suspicion and the two sort of sub sources, if you will, with respect to each of those. Talked about what matters and what doesn't when assessing the sources of claims. So now we're going to get into what really gets me going oftentimes, and that's discussions of media and advertising. So sort of two topics I don't think a lot of people reflect enough on, and I think as critical thinkers, it would behoove us to do precisely that. Think a lot more about what the media is telling us and what we're being told by way of advertising. So first, let's say some things, kind of echo some points that the authors raise with respect to credibility in the media. So we'll start with slide 9 then. So as they pointed out in the 10th edition, page 122, quote, the media have become controlled by fewer and fewer corporations, the result of many mergers and buyouts over the past 3 or so decades, end quote. In fact, so this comes from page 118 of our edition, if you're taking the course, the 13th edition, quote, currently ownership of the news media is in the hands of only 6 companies as compared with thousands in the 1950s. That to me is staggering. So as a result, as they suggested, it's even more imperative than to remain cautious, to be vigilant as critical thinkers when it comes to what's being said by way of what we're hearing through the media. And honestly, so they made it a point to sort of suggest that they ultimately still find the mass media, how do they put it, credible, generally credible, but that we want to remain, always thinking, so to speak. But to me, that given all the things that they point out, and that we'll point out as we proceed, including this larger and larger consolidation of ownership of media, I don't know how you can really have, how you can be anything but completely on guard as critical thinkers when it comes to whatever's being said through the media. And to be honest, as I've gotten older, as this has become something I've appreciated more and more, I've just tuned the media out more and more because of precisely these kinds of realizations. Okay? So look, it's being owned by less and less people, which means less and less views are being represented in what's being told. And I think that's a very important point. And as the authors point out on page 118, the worry with such media consolidation is, quote, the fewer hands that control the media, the easier it is for the news to be managed, either by the owners themselves, or by their commercial advertisers, or even potentially by the government, end quote. And who knows, what's the difference at this point? Maybe it's all the same. So turning to slide 10, and kind of getting into, there's the one sort of reason to be on guard against the media, and that's the fact that it's becoming owned by less and less people or corporations, however you want to put it, and it's going to represent less and less viewpoints. Right? There's also other reasons to be suspicious of the media, and that's that you ultimately don't know, again, what is ultimately driving what's being said. So they allude to, on the top of slide 10, I referenced this, secret government-paid news reports and columns. And so they talked about this in previous editions, and I referenced some of what they said, for example, in the 10th edition here shortly. And they reference this on page 118, this kind of theme that the government does this thing seemingly all the time. I mean, we've discovered these instances that they reference, and I think, as they might have mentioned, we probably only know the tip of the proverbial iceberg when it comes to what it's actually doing, right, in terms of the media and how it's steering what's being suggested through the media, right? So they suggest all these times where it's been found out that the government has paid, for example, for columns to be written or editorials to be written, supporting various government programs with no criticisms of them, right? Paid by the government secretly. These people were paid, right? Unbeknownst at the time, only found out later that this was the case, right? And so again, how do you know that this isn't happening all the time? Right? That's the sort of thing, as critical thinkers, it would behoove us to keep in mind, at the very least. Okay, so as they point out, this is with respect to those sorts of shenanigans. This is the quote in the middle of slide 10, coming from page 123 of the 10th edition. Quote, no criticism of the programs was included, and no mention was made that these were not legitimate independent news reports, but rather were produced by the very same governmental departments that produced the policies in question, end quote. The next quote, the final quote at the bottom, slide 10, coming from pages 125 and 126 of the 10th edition. Quote, a reporter or a columnist or a broadcaster who draws conclusions without presenting sufficient evidence is no more to be believed than some guy from down the street, even if the conclusions happen to correspond nicely to your own bias, end quote. Again, I think that's a very important point to keep in mind for us as critical thinkers. Okay? That just because it's being suggested on the news doesn't mean it's actually true, right? We still have to pass it through, especially given some of these things we've been mentioning, right? Have to pass it through the proverbial claim filter. make sure it actually does warrant our belief. Okay, so slide 11. Again, they talk about, I mentioned this in the introduction to the video, how we kind of get into these various formats of the media, and then go through and kind of give a survey the authors do of sort of things we ought to consider, and I definitely keep those things in mind. Things we ought to consider when it comes to credibility in these various forms of the media. And so, just echoing some of what they've referenced. Be on the lookout with respect to talk radio, oftentimes tainted by, I would say tainted by, political perspectives or agendas. I still remember, probably makes sense, right? One of the reasons why I'm very apolitical, don't pick sides when it comes to political issues, is because I grew up with a father who was very, very much political, and part of his business would entail, driving along with him to on long road trips, and we would be listening to talk radio, and so I know exactly what the authors are referencing when they mention that there's often political perspectives driving what's being said. So it'd be, obviously something you want to be cognizant of as critical thinkers. Are there agendas driving what's being said? I need to always have that in mind. And I think another thing that authors do a nice job of is we have a tendency, right? We've talked about this in prior lectures, corresponding to like chapters 1 and 2, all these psychological biases we have, right, that sort of tend to confirm our own tendencies and ways and dispositions. And so we need to be on guard against that, right? And the fact that that's happening too, and try to be ever aware, if possible, of how our own opinions our initial opinions and drives might be steering kind of how we're viewing things, right? And we think we're applying the filters properly, but maybe we're not, right? So we always got to be a lot of things to keep in mind, right, as critical thinkers, a lot of things to sort of at least be cognizant of to some degree, at least have in the back of our minds, think of at least every once in a while, maybe take a course that we're reminded of these things every once in a while, right? Again, getting back to slide 11, okay, when it comes to talk radio, definitely something we want to be aware of, usually an agenda at play. Internet, right? More and more driving what's going on in our everyday lives. Issue with that, it's great on the one hand. I mean, I have a lot of, personally, I won't get into them, a lot of reflections I've had on the internet and technology in general. The internet, there's no doubt has its benefits, right, in terms of easily accessible, knowledge. I mentioned like demoing a deck. That's actually what I'm doing right now in the process of doing, is demoing our deck and going to then put in a new one. And it's been phenomenal being able to access the internet and get other people's first-hand accounts of what to do. And when I've never done anything like this, that's great. The internet affords us these kinds of opportunities. But as the authors point out, right, there's the good, but there's also the bad. Then anybody, more or less, can access the internet and put more or less whatever they want on there. So our claim filters need to be fully engaged, right, when we are on the internet consuming whatever is being said on the internet. Okay? And I like their reference to Wikipedia. They've referred to this throughout their many editions over the years. And they point out in our edition, page 124, quote, this is from the middle of slide 11. At any given moment, in any given Wikipedia entry, there is the possibility of mistakes, omissions, citation errors, and plain old vandalism, end quote. And again, that's from page 124 of the textbook. And so, very much true and indicative of what could be the case with respect to the internet at large and in general. Right? And they mention how Wikipedia is a great resource, a great place to get started, at least, for all the reasons they mention and get into. But at the same time, especially early on when something just happens, an event's being posted about or an entry is first put in, right, it is susceptible to error, right? And so we need to definitely have our claim filters fully engaged, so to speak, when it comes to Wikipedia for that reason. That said, as I do point out, I like to point this out, a former student, right, once told me that a friend of a friend of their friend of a friend, at a very credible source here, once suggested something along the lines that, hey, nonetheless, Wikipedia entries are as credible or reliable as book-bound encyclopedias, which actually I don't even know if they exist anymore. I think the authors reflected on this when they talk about it. They mentioned something similar on page 124, as I mentioned. So there's that to consider too. How even reliable are good old book-bound encyclopedias? Right there, you always have to have this kind of going, no matter what, even when it seems like you're dealing with a presumably reliable resource or reliable source. By the way, as I mentioned, if you're bored, check out the following kind of ironic, right? I think probably biased site, right? Wikipedia's own article on the reliability of Wikipedia. So I give you the URL for that at the bottom of slide 11. And so, moving on to slide 12, you have issues with respect to credibility in the media when it comes to the sports world. So a lot of my students are into sports, whether it be soccer, basketball, baseball. I remember when I first kind of got into teaching in the Kansas City area, the Royals, that was their World Series year, or at least sort of into after I just started teaching, and I had a bunch of baseball fans, a lot of Royals fans around the area. So a lot of sports fans, and there's the issue of credibility with respect to what you hear in the sports media as well. So I kind of get into a sort of a related case with respect to the sports world. Then on slide 12, I remember this is getting to be quite a few years ago now, a full decade ago, but some of us might remember Brett Favre and when he was a Packer and when he was or wasn't going to come back to the team. It was always kind of up in the air. And granted, a lot of it was probably due in large part to Brett Favre himself and kind of the mysterious nature of his, what he was going to do and leaving that up in the air. But you had all kinds of speculation and media reports that just turned out to be completely ludicrous, right? And coming from seemingly very credible sources at the time, it seemed like, right? So, and so I like to point out then at the bottom of slide 12, the then head coach Brad Childress, kind of what he had to say, kind of commenting on, I don't know what you guys are doing in the media, right? You got to always be on guard against what's being said because it seems to come out of nowhere. So he said of this situation, right, he debunked the claim that he had given Brett Favre an upcoming deadline for deciding whether or not to join the team, saying, quote, absolutely not. Maybe by Deanna Favre, that was Brett Favre's wife, or somebody like that, but certainly not for me. Not even close. I don't know where that dropped out of the sky from. I don't know how you guys in that industry, go about your sourcing. A source that a source said. I don't know. It's questionable. Very questionable. End quote. And that came from Kathan, Minneapolis. I hear you, Brad. Brad Childress, I hear you, right? Again, kind of indicative of why us as critical thinkers ought to be on guard when it comes to the media. Case in point with respect to the sports media there. Okay, moving on to slide 13, the last thing we'll talk about before wrapping things up for lecture 8 here with respect to issues regarding credibility is advertising. This is something that has really, as I've suggested a few times here, piqued my interest over the past decade, I would say. Something as a philosopher I've thought a lot about, reflected on, and have done some writing on and want to pursue academically as well, right? The effects of advertising. I do a lot of reading, and actually the book, as it just so happens to be the case, the book that I am presently reading talks a lot about this very issue of advertising. I love this book so far. I'm about halfway through. It's the four arguments for the elimination of television by Jerry Mander. I don't mean to get into this too much, but it's just amazing to me, the timing of it. He actually spent 15 years, was very successful in the advertising industry. So has a lot of interesting things to say that echo then some of the themes that we'll mention here as we proceed with respect to advertising. And again, he has the perspective, having been a very successful person within the advertising industry. And what was interesting to me, or is interesting, is then why he gets out and he writes the book because of all of his concerns with respect to what's going on when it comes to advertising, because of some of the issues we'll get into here. So I really like, actually, the authors. This is new to the 13th, at least it wasn't in the previous edition that I worked with, the 10th edition. They quoted Stephen Leacock. This is page 126 of our text, so the 13th edition. Quote, advertising is the science of arresting the human intelligence long enough to get money from it, end quote. And don't forget that as critical thinkers. Again, that's why advertising, we're always dealing with interested parties. 99% of the time, parties that want to make money off of us, and the other 1% of the time, parties that want us to do certain things or to vote certain ways, right? But they're always interested, right? By definition, as an advertisement, right? It's trying to get us to do or believe something, okay? That's, as Jerry Mander points out, the author of the book points out, is not necessary. If it's necessary, if it's something we needed, then they wouldn't need to advertise it to us. We would go out and find it or believe it anyway, right? And so it's always pitching something to us that the expert in advertising suggests isn't necessary to us. Okay, so he would suggest not ever necessary to us, otherwise we wouldn't need to be told about it in the first place. So whether you want to be that suspicious, right, you want to at least exercise caution when it comes to ads, okay, for, again, some of these reasons that we're getting into, right? There's usually money at stake, right? Somebody's trying to make money 99% of the time. And for that very reason, as they point out on page 126, if not money, right, they're trying to get you to vote a certain way or do a certain thing. Okay? As they point out then, page 126 of our edition, quote, skepticism is a good policy when considering advertisements and promotions. So look, as I point out, and one of the things that had really, it's been the impetus for me reflecting so much on this is our society is more and more overrun with commercialism and ads. You can't opt out. And, I used to think it was bad 5-10 years ago, when I would play video games or whatever, because you might see something on the case. But now, you play a video game and they have ads even within the video games, right? You can't get out of it. You go anywhere, there's billboards all over, right? There's ads all over. You try to fly anywhere, there's ads all over the walls, right? It's literally everywhere. And these are professionally designed to manipulate us to, again, buy stuff typically or do or believe things that we don't need to, right? If we needed to, at least the argument is by some, we wouldn't need the ads to tell us. So that's the third bullet point. Look, it's becoming more and more prevalent, right? This sort of commercialism in our everyday existence, and we seemingly can't get out of it, can't opt out. And so that's what's really got me going philosophically. What are the ultimate implications of this? And what can we do about it? Even being aware as critical thinkers, flame filters are on high alert whenever we see ads. What can we do? And for at least a decade, whenever there's been commercials on, I've muted whenever possible on TV. I'm to the point now where I don't even really turn on TVs. I'm questioning whether to even get rid of TVs if at all possible in our house. I think my kids might start a riot, but what can we as critical thinkers even do? I've suggested how if you go out into the public, it seems like it's almost impossible to avoid advertisements. And seemingly if you have any sort of screens going on in your house, you're being inundated within your own private homes with ads. I've always suggested instead of having us pay for cable, they should be paying us to be watching cable, because 90% of the time it seems to be ads, right? Even now, here's another example. Even when it's not the regular commercials, right? You watch a football game, there's still commercials within the actual game, right? Or with even a regular program now, they're still throwing in commercials. You can't avoid it at any point, right? It seems to be, again, overrun our society, every walk of life, whether you're outside your home or inside your home. It's even being brought in more and more ways within the privacy of our own homes. What can we do about it? What can the critical thinker do? I mean, is it a desperate sort of situation? That's honestly, that's what has me interested as a philosopher, and one of the things I hope to pursue again academically at some point. So indeed, as they point out in the 10th edition, pages 132 and 131 here, quote, advertisers spend vast sums creating within us new desires and fears, and they can afford to spend whatever is necessary to get each detail of an advertisement exactly right, end quote. And that's one of the things he alludes to as well, is that it's only the same same thing with media. It's only the same few entities that are paying for all the advertisements that can afford all the advertisements on television. He talks about it's the same, and so he was talking about this. This was published back in the late 70s. I can't imagine, that was true back then. Like, it's only gotten worse and worse and worse. The consolidation of not only the media, but again, those that are sort of monopolizing commercials in the advertising industry, and the degree to which we're being shaped and influenced to buy and believe and do all kinds of things. It's fewer and fewer and fewer corporations or entities or individuals. Who knows ultimately? Okay, and again, they can afford to spend whatever is necessary to get each detail of an advertisement exactly right. So turning to slide 14, this is from the 10th edition, page 131. Quote, when confronted with an ad, we should ask simply, does this ad give us a good reason to buy this product? End of discussion, right? As critical thinkers, we shouldn't try to factor in it, try to filter out any emotional baggage associated with what's being expressed. Right? At the very least, try to extract a good reason that's being offered to typically buy the product or endorse the candidate or whatever. Okay? That's like the best case scenario. Maybe it can offer something, right, that we weren't aware of maybe before, right, or at least presents a reason. But one of the upshots, or at least the slide 14, is that even if that's the case, the advertisement itself isn't what justified us, right, in buying the product or in endorsing the candidate, right? That still stood to reason regardless if the ad was there or not. So just keep that in mind, even in its the best case scenario, where an advertisement, let's say, puts it on our radar that something is available or there's some feature of something, right? Don't lend too much credence to the ad because of that, right? You were still justified if you are justified in buying that project, you were still justified regardless, right, of the ad. Okay? That feature of the product still existed regardless of the ad. Right? So, again, don't lend advertisements too much credence because they might do that, okay, sometimes. And that's kind of the point I think I'm getting at the bottom of slide 14. So again, middle of slide 14, as they point out in 126, page 126, remember, again, the reason why we are always so suspicious of advertisers and advertisements and advertising in general is because there are interested parties at play. Bottom of slide 14, coming from page 134 of the 10th edition, quote, an advertisement never justifies purchasing something. Advertisements are written to sell something. Okay, if you are justified in buying the product, and the whole point is you were justified regardless of the ad. Right? The ad is only written to sell you something. Don't ever forget that as critical thinkers. And same sort of point then, already mentioned that on the bottom of slide 14 there. The last thing then we'll do is kind of join the authors, and this was new to the 13th edition, or at least from the 10th edition. And I like this, they're kind of conceptualization or categorization of types of ads into three basic kinds that, and maybe we can put this up on the board, that correspond then to what we talked about, Aristotle's three modes of persuasion. So this corresponds to lecture 3, we talked about Aristotle's three modes of persuasion, which corresponded then lecture 3 to chapter 2 of the textbook, okay, just in case you wanted to go back and find that discussion. But we are talking about, then let's put this up here, sort of three basic kinds of ads. Or one way you can sort of break ads down. The first one are logos ads. So these are the ones that discussed first on slide 15. As mentioned, this is a quote coming from page 126. Quote, these ads emphasize information about a product. But of course, it's just the, quote, information advertisers hope favorably influence our decision about buying their products, end quote. So these can be a little tricky as critical thinkers, and this is what I get into on the bottom of slide 15, okay? Because they're a little bit more alluring, enticing, because they seem to, right, appeal to the rational person, right? They offer reasons to buy the product. You know, it gets great gas mileage, so on and so forth. But the thing to always keep in mind is that you're only getting the one side, right? The one perspective, namely all the good stuff. Okay, they're not going to tell you all the things that are bad, how it had awful safety ratings if that was the case, and so on. Right? You're only getting one side of the perspective, the perspective that helps them sell the product. Okay, so even in the, I would say, arguably as critical thinkers, the best type, right? Because at least you're getting into reasons. Okay? Even in that case, though, it's biased. It's still biased. Okay, so we still need to be on guard against them. So just keep that in mind. Again, that is the point I'm mentioning or emphasizing on the bottom of slide 15. Okay. The next type that we get into then corresponds to that second type of mode of persuasion that Aristotle gets into. Might as well put them all up here. So kind of think reason-oriented, think character, maybe here, character-oriented, and maybe like feelings here. Okay. So ethos-based ads are going to then hold up, and we all are kind of probably familiar with these types of advertisements, right? We just get a particular person who is held up in high regard in that culture or society, you know, modeling a product, okay? Wearing a watch or wearing a hat or whatever the product is. Right? And the idea is the character is the one selling the product, right? We're not getting reasons why the product is good, but just associating the product with the character that's held highly then is helping to sell the product. So as they say, this is the top slide 16, quoting page 126 of the text, quote, these ads display a product as being used or endorsed by people we admire or identify with or feel we can trust. Okay, so it's taking advantage of that positive connection that we or the general public tends to have with highly respected characters. Okay? And of course, that's why you immediately see ad campaigns drop, stars when they have various scandals or whatever, right? They immediately drop them because that's no longer good for business. Okay? Classic example, or one of the examples I thought of when putting this together is like if you're old enough to remember these, the Be Like Mike commercials back in the 1990s. Back in the 90s, Michael Jordan could have basically held up anything and people would have bought the product, right? Because that's how highly regarded Michael Jordan was back then and arguably still is to this day. So a great example of kind of an advertising campaign that relied on, right, ethos ads. Okay, so then finally, turning to slide 17, we have what are known as Pathos Ads. I'll just start with the quotation at the top of slide 17 coming from page 127 of the text. Quote, these ads are primarily intended to arouse emotions in us. Okay, so you can think like certain political advertisements, right? Maybe ones on abortion, for example, tend to have sort of certain images, right, which are regardless of which way they lean, right, conjure up certain types of feelings, and they play on those feelings then to get us, in that case, to maybe vote a certain way. Okay, and so advertisements, other sorts of advertisements, right, the other 99% to get us to try to buy stuff, they do the same thing, right? They can play on our feelings of, so for example, tire commercials might play on our fear of getting in wrecks, right? What would you do, right, if your whole family was in the hospital, right? Playing on our fear, right, to get us then to buy their product, right? You better invest in these new tires as soon as possible, right, to avoid, right, those fears coming to fruition in that case. Okay, so that's what we mean by pathos advertisements. As I mentioned, political advertisements in particular are great examples. So that's alluded to in the middle of slide 17. So bottom quote from page 127, remember, quote, memories and feelings created by an advertising narrative, whether favorable or unfavorable, are not reasons to buy or avoid a product, end quote. Okay, so that's really all I have to say. I'm not going to go on anymore. I could probably rant on and on and on about both of these elements, which is, again, why I find this book so fascinating. 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television by Jerry Nander. Okay, no more commercials, advertisements for him and his appeal to us to eliminate advertisements. How ironic there. But we'll go ahead and close lecture 8 here on credibility. That's it. Next time we get together, then we'll move on to discuss another interesting topic, rhetoric. Closely related to these kinds of pathos ads, right? Rhetoric aims to play on our emotions, to get us to endorse beliefs, to do certain things that maybe as critical thinkers we otherwise wouldn't or shouldn't think and do. If you attach that rhetoric, that emotional baggage and emotional connotations associated with certain words and symbolisms and so on, you can get us to believe and think things we otherwise wouldn't or shouldn't, like I said. So that's why rhetoric is going to be so important, and why we're going to spend a lecture then, the next lecture, lecture 9, discussing rhetoric. Okay, so that'll be correspond then to chapter 5 of the text if you're taking the course. So I'll go ahead and leave you then with the homework assignment from chapter 4. Again, if you're taking the course, the chapter that corresponds to lecture 8 here on credibility is chapter 4. And there it is. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this helpful.